Okay, greetings everyone. Now let's begin. Pathways to Studies on Men and Masculinities in Bangladesh. Page number 144. Pathways to Studies on Men and Masculinities in Bangladesh. Abstract. In any society, the analysis of gender must include men and masculinities, but men and masculinities as research attention is relatively underdeveloped in Bangladesh. This article provides an overview of the current studies on men and masculinities in Bangladesh. Using PubMed and Google Scholar databases, 37 closely relevant full-text documents were reviewed. This review uncovers that the ideal hegemonic version of Bangladeshi masculinity is predominantly constructed / epitomized among others as being the provider, powerful, physically strong, good sexual performer, and having the ability to control a wife. Across studies, the discourse, narratives, and practices of various masculinities in Bangladesh are expressed in the context of religion, migration, sexuality, fatherhood, suicide, violence, women empowerment, sports, and marginality. In some cases, the ideal / hegemonic version of Bangladeshi masculinity encounters serious tensions, ambiguities, resistances, and contestations. Alternative masculine discourses and narratives which reject and resist hegemonic masculine ideals and practices were also noted. This review ends with a call for a structured research direction. Keywords: Bangladesh masculinities, men in review. Introduction. Ever since Australian sociologist Rayon Connell's most influential, transformative, and leading book, Masculinities, was published, men and masculinities as a research scholarship has been expanded dramatically across a wide range of academic disciplines. In Masculinities, Connell laid the foundation for social theory of gender and opened up avenues for theoretical and conceptual arguments on gender, social hierarchy, critical men's studies, and male domination. Femininity as well as feminist theorization of patriarchy. Until now, Connell is regarded as the most influential theorist / scholar in the field on the global scale for developing a broad framework for social constructionist perspectives of gender relations. The core appeal of Connell's theorization indicates that masculinity is a socially constructed phenomenon that entails the differences between men. This theory has contributed to shift our attention from the prevailing sex role theory that fails to acknowledge power relationships both between and within genders and views gender as fixed and inherent characteristics of individuals only. The concept of hegemonic masculinity occupies the central position of her social theory of gender. Connell framed a hierarchical order of masculinities with hegemonic masculinity at the top, while three other versions, such as subordinate, complicit, and marginal masculinities, are ranked below the order. Hegemonic masculinity is symbolically the ideal type of masculinity within the framework that emerges within a particular social, cultural milieu and acts as a benchmark that all men must strive to attain in the wake of maintaining gender order. Ever since, the concept of hegemonic masculinity has not only been extensively used but also sparked several criticisms and debates. For example, scholars have made attempts to place additional models of masculinity such as inclusive masculinity, mosaic masculinity, hybrid masculinity, and sticky masculinity. To name a few, each of the models necessarily provides an explanation regarding men's various involvement with the notion of masculinity and masculine practices. Based on their experiences relevant to a particular model, many African scholars, on the other hand, have cast serious doubt about the relevance and implication of Western centric hegemonic masculinity in the continent as it is associated with complex socio-political processes. Therefore, despite being a powerful model, the implication of the concept of hegemonic masculinity has to be critically assessed in terms of societal, cultural, and transactional context. With regards to the scholarly growth of masculinity studies, Connell assessed the direction of the field as it is not a gigantic field, but it is a significant interdisciplinary enterprise with a rich knowledge base already. The field is still growing. Connell elucidated further. This field is now global, but the consequences of a global field of knowledge are not sufficiently recognized because of the continuing hegemony of the global north in theory, methodology, and academic networks. While Jeff Hearn, another influential scholar of masculinity studies, prefers to term the domain of masculinity studies as critical studies on men and masculinities (CSMM) and finds it as rather messy and fragmented. Far from being organized and coherent, the critical studies on men and masculinity (CSMM) are ontologically, epistemologically, and politically diverse and complicated. Men and Masculinities, on the other hand, is considered the most acclaimed or flagship journal on the subject. This journal celebrated its 20th anniversary of publication 2019. Amongst the scholars who wrote in commemoration of the anniversary special issue of this journal, Cesarni and Essig mapped the directions of the published articles on men and masculinities, including their regional prominence. Most of the articles submitted and published in this journal come from Western countries. For example, among the top 16 countries, the USA represented 42.71% of the total publications, followed by the UK with 15.86% representation. Two non-Western countries such as South Africa and India have that secured places on the list, just maintaining a negligible sharing, occupying 2.50% and 1.27% respectively. The underrepresentation of publications from outside the Western Bloc was explained in two possible ways. Although these arguments seem to be quite simplistic, firstly, as the Western countries are most interested in challenging gender inequalities, they conducted more research on men and masculinities / gender dynamics. Socially, scholars from non-Western countries lack in accessing the tools, methods, and research funding despite having interest in the subject. By taking note of one specific journal, despite its strong prominence in the field, it might be too naive to accept the arguments for such underrepresentation of the body of knowledge produced in non-Western countries. For example, our close observation confirms that several leading specific journals of the field, such as the Journal of Men's Studies, Psychology of Men and Masculinity, Norma International Journal for Masculine Studies, Masculinities, a Journal of Culture and Society, American Journal of Men's Health and Masculinities, and Social Change, continuously publish scholarly works on men and masculinity, not only from both the Western countries but also from other parts of the world. In fact, in some non-Western countries such as South Africa, studies on men and masculinities are now well established as well as adequately voluminous. Studies are burgeoning in several East Asian countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, China, and also in the countries in South Asia. Notably, despite the immersive growth of all areas of gender-related academic and policy works in Bangladesh, a country located in South Asia, there has not been any attempt to follow the trend and directions of the existing scholarship on men and masculinities. Against this backdrop, we attempt to scan and summarize the body of knowledge on men and masculinities in the context of Bangladesh. It further explores the directions of those studies under several emerging themes. It concludes with a call for further research interventions on men and masculinities in Bangladesh. The method. This review locates the existing scholarships on Bangladeshi men and masculinity studies using Google Scholar and PubMed. These two search engines were deliberately used as they can retrieve the highest number of scholarly works. Keywords used in the review included men, masculinity, masculinities, manhood, male sex role, male sexuality, masculinities and violence, fatherhood in Bangladesh, and suicide in men, amongst others. The reference lists of the published articles were also used to locate additional documents. Three criteria were applied concerning the inclusion and assessment of the documents. 1. Explicit presentation of the key essence dynamics of men and masculinities in Bangladesh, available electronically, and 3. Published in English only all the closely relevant academic articles, book chapters, institutional reports, and postgraduate thesis, excepting the duplicates, quasi-similar papers, newspaper articles, and undergraduate monographs were reviewed and analyzed. No exclusion in criterion was imposed in terms of the research approach, empirical and conceptual, and time frame of publication. Considering the paucity of the literature, the final search was made in May 2022. All identified publications were initially screened based on abstract and title for relevance by all the authors. Finally, a total of 37 full-text documents were reviewed. In some cases, documents were freely available online, while in other cases, the library access point of East West University, Dhaka, Bangladesh was used to retrieve the articles. Studies were arranged and analyzed thematically based on the context and configuration of the topics. One remarkable point is that scholars from both Bangladesh and abroad either adequately or jointly continued to scholarship on men and masculinities in Bangladesh, yet no exclusion criterion was applied concerning the origin of the scholars. Discussion. Thematic overview of the Bangladeshi literature constructing masculinity. Hassan, Eglinton, and Persson explored how three different social generations, old, middle, and young, negotiate and construct different forms of masculinity. Although Men of differing social generations understood, viewed masculine real men in terms of money, sexual prowess, being a good provider, and having regular paid work outside the home. Their perspectives also differ across generations or even within the rubric of intra-generations. The marked intergenerational, also intragenerational variations led to the understanding that there is no single or straightforward formulation of Bangladeshi masculinity. The muscular and strong male body roughness has always been idealized as a strong indicator basis of the powerful and dominating form of masculinity. Can this so-called idealized version of masculinity be redefined with the impact of the growing trend of male beautification, consciousness, or practices? So what? Scrutinize this critical question by seeking the perception of the young, educated urban males. Although men uphold the values associated with traditional masculine essential characteristics/attributes such as being breadwinners, powerful decision makers, and physically strong, they maintain a strong inclination towards male beautification as an important category to demonstrate manhood. Such attitude/perception attests to the fact of the changing nature of social constructs of masculinity in Bangladesh. Specific to rural Bangladesh, Imtiaz unfolded three discursive constructions of masculinity, which included real man, hegemonic masculinity, good man, subordinated masculinity, and ordinary man, marginalized or complicit masculinity. The real man/hegemonic model of masculinity includes some essential features for men, such as sole income earner, primary provider to the family, dominant and powerful, having complete authority over family matters, physical and sexual competence, impassive, maintaining family honor, and restricting women's mobility. The good man/subordinate form of masculinity includes laborious men who try to earn a good income, respectful and helpful to others, responsible to family, never use violence against others, and do not discriminate between sons and daughters. Yet most of the characteristics of this kind of masculinity are treated as feminine. On the contrary, men falling into the features of marginalized or complicit masculinity refuse to take risks and may usually become the victims of violence and oppression from the powerful men. Chaudhary and Clisby investigated the articulation of masculinity making among and within the households of construction workers in a Bangladesh city. Broadly, masculine identity is largely constructed through men's ability to provide for their dependents/families. In particular, paid employment for men continues to be understood as a major source of masculine character. This study concluded that masculinity in Bangladesh is neither uniform nor even immune to transformations. Men often have to renegotiate their understandings of the boundaries and parameters of their masculinity as per the changing social circumstances and contexts. Hawk and Kusakabe identified public masculinity and household masculinity among the retrenched male workers in Bangladesh. Under the context of household masculinity, men uphold the status and dignity in the family and enjoy authority over family members by perfectly ensuring their breadwinner role. As such, they detach themselves from household chores, while under the context of public masculinity, men maintain strong social relationships with other fellow men outside their homes. The study argues that men at both levels tried to maintain their masculine identities. When it became difficult to maintain their masculine identity in both places, men first gave up their public masculinity and heightened their household masculinity. Before falling into a state of retrenchment, men were explicitly able to practice hegemonic masculinity. Later on, they had to resort to the complicit version of masculinity through several practices in order to retain their hegemonic masculinity. For example, some men discussed with their wives household responsibilities that enabled women to share household burdens. While doing so, men could maintain their superiority in the households. On the other hand, although some men participated in household chores, they thought this is a temporary provision only. Drawing on a large-scale study, Khan and Townsend confirmed that masculinity is perceived as a multidimensional facet of a man's life. The desired attributes of a real man necessarily include a strong physical appearances, honest and strong character, fearless ability to control a wife and reproduce, maintaining strict discipline in the family, and sexual prowess. Typically, masculinity is viewed in a very gender unequal perspective with an emphasis to control, authority, and sexuality. This study further confirms that being honest and being a strong character is a unique feature aligned with positive masculinity. Migration and masculinity. Pandey's ethnographic study analyzed three phases of migration that Bangladeshi men living and working in Cape Town, South Africa experienced alongside their immediate interface with the process of manhood. For these migrant men, the decision to migrate pre-migration phase is a manhood ritual than an economical solution, since it serves as an ultimate signifier of masculinity. During the second phase, Bangladeshi men's journey to South Africa and their interactions with and control of black African traffickers make a formation of relational masculinity during the whole process of trafficking. Bangladeshi migrant men remain under the control of the traffickers, which severely degrades their own sense of manhood. Finally, these migrant men, upon reaching their destination, recuperated their masculinity through two contrasting strategies: hyper-masculinity with an emphasis on violence and sex, and Ummah masculinity affirmed through celibacy. In another ethnographic study on Bangladeshi migrant men in South Africa, Munshi argued that the economy is not the primary reason for Bangladeshi men to migrate to South Africa, as they are neither poor nor destitute. The prime reason for their migration is the perceived better opportunities and better lifestyles. South Africa has provided Bangladeshi men with a viable means of economic opportunities through the grocery business and a sense of ownership. Yet among the Bangladeshi community there is a class distinction between owners and managers of the shop. Understandably, both groups perform their manhood through continued economic connection with Bangladesh by sending remittances back home, based on the assumption that sending remittances to the family members preserves the traditional masculine breadwinner ideal. Stevanovic-Fenn's narrative study confirms that remitting allows Bangladeshi men living in the USA to preserve their masculine role as providers. It also allows them to maintain status and honor as respectable men both in their own eyes and those of their families. Yet maintaining honor through fulfilling masculine duties can be seriously jeopardized if the male migrants find it difficult to remit money home. This eventually puts a tremendous strain on their male identity. This study further explicits times when migrant men were out of a job but still had to send money home to maintain their role in providers. For them, sending remittances as is a moral obligation. It must not be questioned but executed. So what? Analyzed the patterns of role changes among migrant Bangladeshi men in the UK. Findings confirmed those migrant men, while they were in Bangladesh, enjoyed the dominating position as men in their family. However, after the migration of the UK, they have to undergo some marked role changes. Majority of the migrant Bangladeshi men have to adopt new attributes of masculine characteristics. They are forced to take part of domestic responsibilities once their partners start working outside to financially support the families. Economic hardship stands as a cruel reality for the migrant men that obliges them to share or even leave their hierarchical position in the family. The findings confirm that these men develop a kind of hybrid model of masculinity. Some of them accept changes positively regarding their masculine attributes. They do not find current practices damaging, while some of them could find new roles threatening to their traditional hegemonic model of masculinity. Using Bourdieu's notions of class, Yi examined how Bangladeshi migrant men from Singapore make sense of their migration and masculinity, particularly after they fall out of work. The economic lives of Bangladeshi male labor migrants in Singapore reflect intense structural discrepancies, and they are the victims of economic exploitation and subordination. Despite intricacies, they make powerful meanings of men and masculinities in the context of globalized labor market. Engaging in wage work is the highest symbol of masculinity. They have taken overseas work as they are men and have complex social goals and cultural obligations. Violence and masculinity. One of the early studies on masculinity in the context of Bangladesh was conducted by Blanchett, which examined how masculinities are constructed through different practices of violence against women in rural areas. Different constructions of hegemonic masculinities, such as a husband's right to teach or discipline his wife's right to release anger through abuse, the husband as the absolute master who provides shade and protection, and so on, are not only some forms of usual practices and expectations but also help to institutionalize violence against women. Anwari confirms that the hegemonic form of masculinity is often achieved through intimate partner violence. Based on context analysis, this study finds the perpetrators through acts of violence use Bangladeshi cultural norms to uphold and reproduce hegemonic norms. In this sense, violence against an intimate partner is considered a performance by which violent men present or validate legitimate their masculine identities by controlling and instructing women. Hence, violence stands as an essential component of masculinity. Acid violence is an exceptional form of violence that is intentionally used to destroy the self and subjectivity of women by permanently disfiguring their bodies. Chaudhury's content analysis on acid violence reports that undereducated, underemployed men practice such cruelty as a means to assert power and domination, to reinstate their experiences of inadequate form masculinity, if any. Men are socialized to reenact hegemonic masculinity in the typical Bangladesh patriarchal society by inflicting such harmful practices on women. Donis and others also found that men tend to penetrate violence to re-establish a gender order/masculinity in which they earn respect as breadwinners and authority figures, the interruption of this gender role is an indication of a crisis in masculinity that places them in a state of loss of respect and honor from their family and peers. The perceived state of vulnerability or fear of having one's masculinity motivates men to be involved in harmful masculine practices by inflicting violence in the process. Using Cornell's concept of hegemonic masculinity, Kamal explored young university students' dominant gender practices in relation to their construction of hegemonic masculinity. By enacting various social practices, young men find themselves attaining hegemonic masculinity and positioning themselves in a dominant position in the gender order. Many acts/discourses considered to be gender-based violence are embedded in the daily life practices of young men. For example, young men's practices discourses like Valo May, Baje May, good girl, bad girl, Moja Kora, having fun, Piche Laga, following and stalking, Shikka Dewa, revenge and punishment, Kotha Shunai, controlling mechanism linked to the dominant enactment of violence against women and girls. A study constructed by Chaudhary has gone beyond the conventional research, focusing on capturing the issue of violence against women and masculinity, but included the complex dynamics of violence against Bangladeshi men perpetrated along the India, West Bengal, Bangladesh cross border. This study paid a critical look at violence against Bangladesh men involved in the illegal cross border activities, while physical abuse, firing, and offensive speech are the manifestations of some of the patterns of hegemonic/dominant masculinities. Among which the border guards' subjugated and marginal masculinities are attached to male civilizations whose minds and bodies have been the spots for practicing hegemonic/dominant masculinity by the guards. This study tries to understand the performance of masculinity in terms of domination, subjugation, marginalization, and resistance by male figures, border guards, on the bodies and minds of other men. The performance of masculine physically and ideology of the cross-border line opens up avenues for the rethinking of law, sovereignty, politics, and the questions of rights. Another research focus also goes against typical currents of masculinity and violence carried out by Khan and Arendise. This research captures the aspects of domestic violence perpetrated by women against men in Bangladesh. They argued the dominant societal notion portrays women as the natural victims while men as the perpetrators. Such as notion makes it particularly difficult to contextualize men's experiences of domestic violence, drawing on pertinent evidence. This research confirms men are often victimized at the domestic level. In the context of Bangladesh, men's natural tendency of non-reporting, absence of agency or legal support, and a growing gender-blind focus on women's issues have undermined and sidelined the problem of domestic violence against men. Sexuality and masculinity, Khan and others, for example, highlighted the inconsistencies associated with gender-based socialization. In Bangladesh, they create an essentialist framework of male sexuality where phallus, performance, and power are at the core of men's sexual health-related masculine threats. In this sense, real men must be sexually potent to demonstrate sexual power through sustained penile erections, penetration, and prolonged sexual intercourse. Both rural and urban men in this study deem sex as an agency of power, dominance, and governance. Sexual performance with a large-sized penis symbolizes masculine power to control women. Even monetary achievements become valueless if men are sexually incapable. The study concluded that discrepancies between expectations of masculine sexuality and compromised performance in their sexual lives could silently endanger men's sexual health and relationships with women. Earlier, Khan also noted that the crisis of masculinity is reflected in exaggerated notions of male sexual prowess, which are often hard to achieve, resulting in much frustration among men in the wake of the dominant construction of masculine sexuality. Men's ongoing tensions about sexual performance or the struggle to become sexually powerful negatively affects men's sexual health and relationships with women. The accounts of men in the study reveal that the ability to perform prolonged intercourse and satisfy their partners ensure success in masculinity. Failure to offer satisfactory sex is considered shameful by men, threatening their masculine sexuality and ability to acquire women. For many men, sexual potency is seen as critical to maintaining a man's power. The complexities, conflicts, concerns, and contradictions often repress them disturbingly when they find the essential components of masculine sexual prowess unachievable. Such achievement is similar to other indicators of manly success. In another study, Khan and Arion highlighted the worries and beliefs of men regarding sexual performance and psychology, size and shape of the penis, and quality of semen. Their concerns are strongly affected by the perceptions of sexuality within the framework of societal and normative values associated with the image of real masculinity. Men living with anxieties about sexual performance holds the idea that they cannot align with the concept of real masculinity. However, many of their worries reflect misinformation about the male psychology and sexual health. On the other hand, Kabir explored that male students at tertiary level institutions will fully endorse hegemonic masculine ideals, which are most likely to be engaged in risky sexual practices such as having sex without contraceptives. The non use of contraceptives is premised on certain discourses, such as males and are powerful and stronger as they have a penis, females are considered as a commodity for sexual urge, and tendency to impose decision over females. All these discourses turn into a state of reluctance for men not to use a contraceptive to demonstrate manhood. Street healing in Bangladesh has an enormous impact on male sexual health in Bangladesh. Majma street canvassing is a popular means of selling medicines in Bangladesh. While street healers sell different types of medicines, those that offer or guarantee male sexual prowess. While speaking of the loss of semen, premature ejaculation, and penis size receive significant attractions as buying products. Anam's 2010 ethnographic study confirms that street healers combine different local cultural ideas in their street canvassing to represent real men and serve the cultural purpose as means of the manhood making process in Bangladesh. Street healing through canvassing thus acts as a unique resource to build the emic model of male sexuality/masculinity. Hassan and Algleton explored the narratives of three distinct social generations of men in Bangladesh about gender and masculinity and sexual health seeking practices. For the older generation, men's health care seeking for sexual health problems was exception rather than the norm. They had never sought professional or other types of help for sexual health problems. Most men of the other social generations saw themselves as sexually healthy and believed that they did not have problems requiring help when they were young. Middle social generation said that they had not sought support for sexual health either because they saw themselves as not needing to do so or they felt lodja shame in doing so. Younger social generation men's accounts suggested that they had sought relatively little help for sexual health issues and problems. The authors found clear evidence of the relevance of masculinity to men's help seeking for sexual health. In such a context, cultural notions associated with the ideals of good hegemonic masculine performers, for example, prevented men from seeking sexual health. Hassan, based on personal experiences, provided an overview of the critical methodological issues and of challenges in studying men and masculinities in relation to men's sexual health in Bangladesh. As a predominantly Muslim country, discussing sexuality is largely considered a taboo subject. The researchers face challenges in gaining access and in discussing sex and sexuality issues. It is suggested that careful planning, innovative strategies, and preparation are required when studying sex, sexuality, and masculinity within such contexts. Women in development, women empowerment, and masculinity. Karim and others attempted to explore rural men's multiple views on female participation in socioeconomic and healthcare initiatives. The views and reactions of men on married women's participation in development generally conform to dominant views of masculinity prevalent in rural Bangladesh. The study further reveals that men's views on women's participation are gradually changing from fear of losing the male authority to a realization of women's positive contribution to family welfare in the context of the dominant patriarchal traditions of rural Bangladesh. These findings provide a new understanding of the dynamics and variations among men, as well as the variability of the concept of masculinity encompassing different intersectional groups. Schuyler and others examined men's views of various manifestations of women's empowerment, gender, and the legitimacy of men's perpetration of intimate partner violence (IPV). In the context of changing gender norms, with a few exceptions, rural men described improvements in female education and changes in women's work and economic contribution had brought positive consequences to society. Men with a growing acceptance of egalitarian gender norms and their self-reported decreasing propensity to engage in IPV seem to have been driven largely by the desire to improve their economic status through their wives' labor and resource management. On the contrary, men's disliking of women empowerment was more symbolic than pragmatic. They felt that due to women's empowerment, their hegemony and natural superiority as men were being challenged. They also expressed their concerns and empowered women violate social norms and saw this as an insult to men. For them, it is a sign of malice and disorder in society. Eventually, they equated gender equality as a threat to their masculinity. The study found some unevenness and contradictory notions of masculinity regarding women's empowerment. The impact of masculinity is unusually absent in the vast literature on microcredit, the cornerstone of gender/women's empowerment programs in Bangladesh. Ahmed's study is the only available example. They included male relatives, husbands of microcredit borrowers who identified 4 different categories of abusive, high-minded, mixed, and Babla lacking in common sense, husbands exemplifying equating four different types of masculinities. As the first step of a poverty alleviation strategy that uses men to change men, high minded masculinity needs to be rewarded and abusive masculinity needs to be transformed. The article concludes if high minded men can be identified, supported, and rewarded, they can act as social change agents, which the household and in the community for greater access for women to microcredit programs. Fatherhood and masculinity. Despite having a traditional image of fathers as a distant authority figures and breadwinners in Bangladesh, Ball and Wahadi's analytical note observed that many fathers are involved with their children in a wide range of situations and provide for a variety of children's needs. While mothers are children's primary caregivers, fathers make the major decisions concerning children's healthcare, education, and social life. The authority therefore said fatherhood stands as an important element in the construction of Bangladeshi masculinity. They identified several forms of fatherhood in Bangladesh, such as family fathering, isolated fathering, sibling fathering, and lone fathering, serving the purpose of distinctive needs and goals. For example, family gatherings involves men who provide basic care and support, often spend time with the children, play with them, and pass on knowledge and skills in their respective areas of interest and capability. Isolated fatherings occurs when fathers live away from their children for work. Sibling fathering involves when both parents work. Elder siblings, boys, are assigned to take the role of supervising younger children. Finally, the lone fatherings happen for men and women. Mothers are absent from their children for a long time for the purpose of work or even when they are dead. This study suggests that understanding fatherhood in Bangladesh or explicating ways to encourage fathers' positive involvement would yield insights to attain culturally defined goals for children and families. Religion and masculinity. Samuel was interested to explore the patterns of contemporary versions of Islam reflected through Islamic movement of pietist inclinations such as the Talebi Jamaat might impact on young masculine ideas of young men who are living in both UK and Bangladesh. Interestingly, inclinations to Tablighi Jamaat acted to produce a gender less patriarchal and more feminized, gender tolerant masculine Bangladeshi Muslim identity among its adherents. The article suggests the presence of different forms of masculinity, in particular the Tablighi Jamaat's Piktism maintains strong Sufi connections, Sufi ideas of personal purification, and self-abnegation. Fana, in relation to the divine, provide the basis for a downplaying of male assertiveness and masculine authority. Suicidal behavior and masculinity. Of late, Khan, Ratele, Helman, De Lamini, and Makama, and Kanderi and Helman explored the connection between hegemonic formation of masculinity and men's suicide and suicide attempt, respectively. These two qualitative studies, conducted in one of these suicide prone areas of the country, found men's motivation of taking their own lives is strongly associated with the diverse manifestations of crisis of hegemonic masculinity. For example, failure to provide for the family, relationship trouble, no control over the wife, physical and mental illness. Loss of status, difficulties in demonstrating material success, and so on stood as the most triggering factors for men's suicidal behavior. Suicide and suicide attempt. In short, the gap between the ideal version of hegemonic masculinity and the real life situation leads to suicidal behavior. In a slightly different vein, Khan, Rateli, and Arendesi explored the post suicide attempt events of men. In particular, society's attitude conveys critical messages to suicidal men about the suicide attempts and constructions of masculinity. In this study, suicide supervisors encountered several severe cultural stigma about their masculinity. Society broadly stigmatized suicide attempts as a cowardly and feminine act. As per the perception of society, men must adhere to masculine norms and be prepared to encounter the challenges of life. In another publication, Khan, Arendesi, and Rateli provided a subjective understanding of the way men's suicide and suicide attempt were triggered by the complexities and contestations associated with intimate relationships in the rural context. Their experiences conflicted with the Bangladeshi norms of hegemonic ideal masculinity. Men confronted difficulties in complex ways in maintaining or reinforcing the cultural mandate of hegemonic ideal manhood status within intimate partnerships. Maintaining the hegemonic masculine ideals or socially prescribed perfectionism in intimate relationship context was extremely problematic for them. Suicide was viewed by these men as a counter-reaction to the perceived threat or a way out for not being able to live up to the demands of hegemonic masculinity. Sports and masculinity. Hossein highlighted the ways cricket has become a site of new nationalist masculinity in Bangladesh by examining an issue of controversy about a Bangladeshi cricketer's sexual entanglement with a movie actress just before the World Cup. Bangladesh cricket supporters widely viewed this athlete's sexual aggression, despite charges of rape and sexual harassment, as an expression of Bangladeshi masculinity. The author concludes that such heterosexual and masculinist politics relegated women to a commodity in the formation of a cricket-based nationalism. Marginally and masculinity, this discursive notion of the Western model of hegemonic masculinity falls short apart to deliver extensive conceptual and practical implications in the complicated context of marginal society. From that contextual praxis, Khan expressed concern about the implications of the Western model of hegemonic masculinity in Bangladesh. Unlike the Western context, men in marginal society are in constant negotiations with the livelihood means and practicalities in some critical and disturbing ways, bringing examples from various pressing socially troubling issues such as poverty, unemployment, migration, and so on. The author concludes that the conceptual version of Western hegemonic masculinity seems unpersuasive to express men's real world situations. Thus, studies on men and masculinities must embrace the local context and cultural realities. In a recent study, Khan and others highlighted that climate change is a major consideration to express marginal masculinities. Climate change has a gender phase showing differential hazards for men and women linked to the structures of gender in society. They draw attention to issues related to masculinities in the context of climate change, discussions in Bangladesh and also South Africa, and point out that climate-induced impediments such as drought, floods, salinity, lightning, and high temperatures put enormous challenges to the fulfillment of men's socially prescribed roles and responsibilities as men. Conclusion and imperatives for future research directions. In recent years, increasing attention has been paid to varied understandings of gender relations, including the multiple dimensions of men and masculinity. Bangladesh is no exception. Gender analysis continues to be regarded as a forefront issue in academic and policy discourses in Bangladesh. Under this context, this review tends to specifically offer some broader reflections on the trends and dimensions of men and masculinity studies in Bangladesh. Research on men and masculinities in Bangladesh is a relatively new initiative, apparently a post-2000 phenomenon. Although studies in this area have not been extended significantly in terms of numbers but growing, they seem to have covered some basic, important, and critical areas. Stated differently, Bangladeshi scholars have made some important contributions towards advancing the field of study. The current review was arranged thematically based on some emerging topics such as constructions, violence, sexuality, migration, religion, fatherhood, suicidal behavior, marginalization, sports, and women empowerment. Women in development themes that have emerged out of this review portray a dynamic interplay of how masculinities are contextualized, constituted, and diffused into different intersections in Bangladesh. The key findings of the study is summarized in the following. The first theme, constructing masculinity, made an impression on the essential characteristics of Bangladeshi masculinity. Despite the obvious fact that masculinity as a concept is difficult to define because of its diverse practices, variations, configurations, processes, and orientations. At last, there is now some level of understanding about the formation of masculinity in the context of Bangladesh. Across studies, the ideal image of Bangladeshi masculinity, irrespective of rural and urban differences, entails some typical hegemonic notions such as primary family provider, powerful control over family members, sexual prowess, and physically strong, among others. However, there is some evidence of other forms of masculinity as well. Bangladeshi masculinities tend to embrace some changing nodes in response to socioeconomic perspectives. The second theme, migration and masculinity, confirmed that the migration of men is essentially a masculine intervention in which men opt out of moral and economic obligations. The notion of masculinity may take several shapes depending on the context of migration and also destination country. The obligation of migrant men to perform the economic role is often challenging, and sometimes men need to negotiate with the hegemonic model of masculinity. The third theme, violence and masculinity, informs that violence against women is often perpetrated by men as a means to uphold or reinstate men's hegemonic masculine honor and status. Violence acts as a social norm that confirms male domination over women. While much has been researched on the practices of masculinities in the context of violence against women, one study captured various manifestations of masculinities that emerged in the context of violence against men by other men, and another study on violence against men by women at the domestic level. These studies confirm that masculinities can also be powerfully framed beyond conventional male-female relations. Several studies capture the connectedness between sexuality and masculinity under the fourth theme. Sexual prowess or potency provides the symbolic meaning of hegemonic masculinity in Bangladesh. Therefore, popular cultural practice such as selling medicines through street canvassing that improves sexual power serves an important purpose for demonstrating masculinity. It is also interesting to note that men tend not to use contraceptives as it degrades the image of manhood. This theme also confirms that it is considered unmasculine to seek help in the event of sexual health-related problems and tensions. Without considering the implication of masculinity into account, women's increased participation in development initiatives might not end up with a positive outcome. The fifth theme, women in development, women empowerment, and masculinity, plays a critical role in the several notions and practices of masculinity in relation to women in development/women empowerment. There are mixed reactions among men concerning women's engagement in productive activities. In some cases, men see it as a threat to their hegemony, but in other cases, it is not a threat. Suggestions have also been put in place to change men's perceptions concerning women's greater access to productive interventions. The sixth theme, fatherhood and masculinity, captures one study only which identifies several forms of fatherhood in Bangladesh. Beyond the traditional image of being a distant dominant figure, fathers in Bangladesh play different important positive roles based on the situation. The seventh theme, religion and masculinity, confirms that the hegemonic image of masculinity is compromised when men get involved in Talib-e-Jamaat, as the philosophy of this religious path teaches how to become modest and sublime. The next theme, suicidal behavior and masculinity, explores the ways crisis in masculinity leads men to commit suicide. In fact, when men find several ideal embodiments of hegemonic masculinity are in crisis, they find no better solution but to kill themselves. It is such a disturbing situation for men that they ends up with a huge compromise with the hegemonic masculine norms. The ninth theme, sports and masculinity, entails the notion that sport is a symbol of hegemonic masculine virtue. A sportsman is broadly supported by broader society despite the fact of his engagement in sexuality, coercive behavior. The final theme, marginality and masculinity, gives a message that being a marginal country in terms of socioeconomic conditions, it is impossible for men to practice Western-centric hegemonic masculinity in the context of Bangladesh. So suggestions have been put in place to get away from the conceptual epistemic imperialism of hegemonic masculinity. Under the context of marginality, a specific study highlighted the impact of climate change on men in Bangladesh. It expresses how gender norms and relations are connected to climate change vulnerability. Several suggestions/directions are placed with regard to future research interventions. Future empirical works should touch upon Bangladeshi masculinities available both within and outside the country. For example, critical interventions are needed to explore the complex intersections between masculinity and different levels of social inequalities, powerlessness, masculinity and men's health behaviors, masculinity and violence against men and children, masculinity and disability nature and dynamics of transformative masculinities, young masculinities, and so on. It is noted that masculinity is conventionally regarded as heterosexual, but is not always the case. Represented by sexuality studies, what are the dynamics of masculinities within intersectional social relations such as the LGBTQA plus the context of Bangladesh? What seems to be an urgent need to adequately and inclusively study Cornell's integrated theorization, comprising four hierarchical arrangements of masculinities, hegemony, subordination, complicity, and marginalization, and their implications in the social and cultural context of Bangladesh. In particular, conducting more work on fatherhood is suggested considering its growing importance in gender relations. From the capital men and masculinity perspectives, methods, and methodology employed in the studies are important for assessment. Men and masculinity studies adopted many different research methods such as quantitative, qualitative, or even mixed research approaches consistently. It has been noted in the review that the qualitative research approach is preferable by scholars. Therefore, future researchers in Bangladesh may consider applying a quantitative approach. Most of the current literature on men and masculinities in Bangladesh is framed through Western frameworks and theories. Therefore, it is suggested scholars should engage with an explicit approach that appropriately contextualizes the epistemic version of Bangladeshi masculinity. Done.